and we're going to go ahead and get started. I would like to provide just a little bit of who you're seeing on our screen today, starting with my colleagues, Chris Garland, our Community Development Manager, and also based in Cleveland, Ohio, and also Elizabeth Coates, our Director of the Homeownership Alliance, based in DC, and Elizabeth will be doing some updates later on for us. And then at not necessarily, at least the bottom of my screen, I've got also Kristopher Smith and Ashley Williams Clark, who are presenters today. And I'm going to spend just a couple minutes talking about their backgrounds as we get started. But certainly, again, you're here for the heirs property rights, implications, and interventions using a data and evidence approach to preserving ownership. And so thanks for being here. A little bit more about our first presenter, Ashley Williams Clark. She is the Vice President of Detroit Future City and the Director of the Center for Equity, Engagement, and Research, otherwise known as the Center. In this role, Ashley leads and manages the Center's work with a focus on promoting economic equity in Detroit through evidence-based research, policy recommendations, and engaging Detroit residents and community leaders to understand and utilize Detroit Future City's research. Ashley has more than 15 years of experience in public policy research and analysis, also community engagement, program development, and project management. Prior to joining Detroit Future City, Ashley worked for the City of Detroit's Housing and Revitalization Department on the public-private partnerships team. She also served as the Director of Outreach and Strategic Partnerships at the University of North Carolina, UNC, at Charlotte Urban Institute, a nonpartisan applied research and community outreach institute. While at the UNC Charlotte Urban Institute, Ashley also was the intern and associate director of the Integrated Data System and led the Institute's research and community engagement initiatives that addressed affordable housing and homelessness. Ashley previously held joint roles at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., as a research associate on the Metropolitan Housing and Communities team, and as the Director of Operations for the Urban Institute Academy for Public Policy Analysis and Research, a training and mentoring program. Ashley has a master's degree in city and regional planning from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and a bachelor's degree in urban studies from Washington University in St. Louis. She's a member of the Leadership Detroit Class 43. Thank you for being here, Ashley. Kristopher Smith is also our presenter today, and Kristopher is a Community Development Officer at LISC Jacksonville, where he co-directs LISC's Family Wealth Creation Initiative and creative placekeeping efforts to advance economic growth in urban core neighborhoods. Kristopher designed and launched the Heirs Property program in Jacksonville, Duval County in 2021. Kristopher has over 25 years of experience in public sector and community development work. Prior to joining LISC Jacksonville's team, Kristopher completed a 16-month stint as Director of Services at the Community Action Council in Lexington, Kentucky. Kristopher also served as a consultant and senior fellow at the Foundation for the Mid-South, from October 2016 through October 2018. Prior to his work at FMS, he served as the Director of Leadership Development at the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities from 2008 to 2016. And during that time, he worked closely on the Restoring Prosperity in Older Industrial Cities group to allocate resources and oversee project execution. Kristopher also managed the Funders Network's year-long fellowship known as Places that provides philanthropic leadership training and skill-building opportunities. Kristopher holds a Master of Arts in Public Administration from Nova Southeastern University, a Bachelor of Arts in Public Science from Bethune-Cookman University, and certification in entrepreneurship education from Babson College. Thank you so much for letting me read the great background on both Kristopher and Ashley's experience. And I would like to also just, sorry, I'm getting over a little cold, let you know that we will provide copies of the presentation along with a recording of this video on NCST's website. And with that, I'll go ahead and Ashley ask you to go ahead and take the floor and share your screen.
Great. Thank you so much for the warm introduction and for having us here today. It's always fun or weird hearing your bio read out loud. Thank you so much again. Just a little bit of background on Detroit Future City. We are a nonprofit think and do tank based in Detroit. And our goal and our focus is really on how to build an equitable and sustainable city that works for all of us. And so over the next few years, we're really targeting in on how do we create thriving, resilient neighborhoods and increase income and wealth for Black Detroiters and other Detroiters of color. And we do that through our research and through activating programs and other innovations. And so I'm really excited to be here with all of you today to share a little bit more about one of our most recent reports on a topic that has implications for both Black homeownership, wealth creation, and neighborhoods. So this report came about when we had our funder reach out to us because they were noticing a challenge as they were working to keep Detroiters in their homes and avoid tax foreclosure. They were noticing that when people were going to access really important resources, one of the things that was happening is that they were discovering that they weren't actually on the deed to their homes that they thought that they had inherited from a family member. And so in our work at DFC, as we work to grow and protect Black wealth and grow the number of middle-class neighborhoods, we saw deep value in diving into this topic, which isn't unique to Detroit. It's something that I think every one of you would find in your communities. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. We were able to partner with our local data intermediary, Data Driven Detroit, on this project. And we were also able to engage with local community partners and people impacted by Heirs Property to help inform our work. So what is an heirs property? An heirs property is a property that's been inherited through generations or passed on to recipients without formal legal proceedings to prove ownership. And this can happen one of two ways. The first is that there's no will. So in the absence of a will, or a will that doesn't cover the property, the state kicks in with a certain law called intestate succession, which determines the sequence in which surviving heirs can receive a share of the property. The other way is that there might be a will, but it doesn't actually automatically transfer the property to the will's beneficiaries. The will has to go through probate, it has to be validated, and then a new property deed filed, and that doesn't always happen. And this is really important because without having that clear ownership, without having your name on the deed to a house, it can impact individual household stability. There can be an increased likelihood of losing your home and being forced to move either due to ownership disputes or foreclosure. It also limits people's ability to benefit financially from homes. Part of owning a home is a wealth creation strategy. And if your name's not on that deed, it can limit your ability to sell the property, borrow money against its equity, or even something as simple as obtaining homeowners insurance. It also limits its access to resources from the city, in our case, or other federal resources that could help you with making your homeownership more affordable. And all of this in terms of whether households aren't able to maintain the home, take care of the home, invest in the home, all of that can have implications and impact on the housing condition of the home and the surrounding neighborhood. So what are some of the challenges around heirs property? And this is coming from our context in Detroit, but I think it applies to many other places as well. The first is just a general lack of wills and estate plans. Not everybody who is a homeowner or in general has a will or estate plan in place. And compounding that is the fact that legal advice and case filing, both in terms of developing a will, but also after somebody is deceased, going through the probate process, as well as rectifying a tangled title, can be really complicated and expensive. And to that point, there's also a lack of support in navigating that complex legal process. There's also an issue in people not being aware of what that property ownership status is. As I mentioned, sometimes it wasn't until people were in a moment of crisis, of needing support, that they found out that they weren't actually on the deed to their home. Also, neighborhood perceptions impact, and many homeowners might be deterred by housing market and neighborhood perceptions, which can impact both them seeing value in having a home to pass on, as well as an heir wanting to take on a property and care for it. There's also challenges around property tax implications. In our case, when somebody transfers a property, that can cause an uncapping of taxes and cause a tax jump. And so there's more opportunities to increase knowledge around the tax implications and ways to offset those taxes. And these challenges and this impact of heirs property, it's most deeply felt by Black homeowners and other people of color. There was a study done by the National Consumer Law Center that looked at some of other studies and found that BIPOC people are between 10 to 14% less likely to have estate planning in place than their white counterparts. And as I noted, this issue of heirs property, it's not unique to Detroit, and it exists in every one of your communities. And if you are a homeowner, your home is potentially an heirs property if you don't have a will in place. But given all of the differences in community history and context, it was really important for us to understand what the issues around heirs property were in the Detroit context and the scale of that issue. So what does this look like, and how did we do it? The first step was we were able to get data from the City of Detroit's Office of the Assessor. Unfortunately, our Register of Deeds data is not readily accessible, so we were able to use the tax assessor's data as a proxy. We were able to obtain all of the owners' names, and we cross-referenced that with death records from a service called the Melissa Data, and they have death records going back to 2014. And so we were able to match the data sets and ping them and end up with a list of likely heirs properties, which are parcels in the assessor's office where all listed owners are deceased. And again, that's since 2014. We surrounded all of that with community context, from talking to community partners, from talking to people impacted by heirs properties. In total, we identified 5,525 heirs properties in Detroit. Again, noting that we use assessor's data as well as we were able to go back to 2014, we really view this as an undercount and really just a starting number from which to work off of. But that 5,525 properties is significant in terms of the wealth that it holds, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The majority of these homes are likely owner occupied, about 76%. And that's important, I think, not just in terms of home ownership and wealth creation, but also recognizing for that renters, heirs property pose a different challenge and situation if they're not aware that the person they're renting from does not actually legally own the property. In terms of the dispersion of where we saw these heirs properties, we saw them across the city, both on the east side and on the west side. And there were 35 tracts that had more than 40 heirs properties. The most that we had in one tract was 98 heirs properties. And when we looked at these tracts and we looked at some of the demographic characteristics of them, these were the tracts where we saw the highest share of or highest number of heirs properties were tracts that had a higher Black population, higher home ownership rates, and higher home sales prices. And so this is an issue that really was impacting our middle-class neighborhoods as well as other neighborhoods throughout the city. On this map, what you'll see is the areas in purple are some of our neighborhoods that have higher sales prices. And each of those little dots represents an heirs property. So again, what you can see here is that these heirs properties intersect with both some of our higher valued neighborhoods in terms of sales price, as well as ones that have lower sales prices. And we had at least 215 properties with a sales price of over $150,000, which is significant for Detroit. In total, we were able to estimate that there's more than $268 million tied up or locked into these 5,525 heirs properties. So again, as we talk about preserving Black wealth, as we talk about preserving home ownership, it's important that we are addressing those heirs properties, especially those that have those higher values and those higher amounts of equity. Another thing that we were able to do to make this data actionable is that we were able to link it with our tax foreclosure data. And we were able to look at properties that are immediately at risk for tax foreclosure and cross-reference them to see which ones might be heirs properties. And in total, we found 496 properties. And on this map, broken down by council district, you can see the ones with the darker purple are areas that had higher numbers of properties at risk of tax foreclosure that were also heirs properties. And those properties are being targeted currently for additional resources to be able to help prevent tax foreclosure where possible. one of the most important things that we know as we talk about this, we were looking at like, here's what the number of current heirs properties are estimated to be. But the thing that we stress the most is that in theory, any property that has not gone through an estate planning process is at risk of becoming an heirs property. So it's also important for us to look at what future risks could be. And we looked at literature, we looked at examples of other work, we looked within our own community at some of the factors that intersected with heirs property. And we identified 3 different pieces that can increase risk of heirs property, and then also one thing that can decrease risk. And so what we identified were that tracts that had a higher share of households with older populations, with higher share of quitclaim deeds and higher shares of vacant parcels were more at risk of becoming an heirs property, as well as decreased risk, which were parcels with an estate planning related deed. So if you have a deed or an estate plan in place, that should decrease your risk of becoming an heirs property in the future. And we were able to map that across our community to identify areas for future risk that could be areas that are focused on for intervention. So how do we address this? And I think within our organization as well as nationally, there's kind of 3 buckets that you can look at in terms of resolving current heirs properties, preventing future heirs properties, and then doing policy reform to address this at the systems level. Within resolving current heirs properties, there's the opportunity to increase coordination and capacity of our local system to handle properties from intake to resolution, and connecting heirs to resources to help them obtain that clear title. On the prevention piece, outreach and education are huge in terms of talking about the importance of wills, trusts, estate planning, expanding capacity for estate planning support through strategic partnerships, supporting and empowering homeowners to help them ensure they have clear title. And then also in our case, in which we have homes that might not want to be passed on or have an heir identified, creating those stable pathways for homes without designated heirs. And then lastly, for the policy reform, there's opportunities for us locally to improve heirs property probate processes, to amend city policies to accommodate folks who are facing heirs situations. There's examples of this at the national level in terms of FEMA and accepting alternative methods of proof of ownership other than a deed. And then there's also a national movement around something called the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. And there's a recent report that came out that I'll put in the chat that dives a lot more into some of the legal tools that can be used at the state level to address heirs property. So all of this has been wrapped up in our most recent report. We also did an accompanying primer. We wanted to make sure that this information could be accessible to community members, and we could break this down in a way that would resonate with homeowners and residents. And so we have an accompanying primer that I'll also put in the chat. So we're excited for how this work will be activated in Detroit, and we're learning a lot from our next speaker, Kristopher Smith, who is really, I think, at the forefront of this work in Jacksonville. So thank you all.
Yeah, Ashley, I think that's my cue. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and get going. That was a terrific presentation, by the way, and I'll try not to sort of go over ground that you've already covered. So my name is Kristopher Smith. I'm with LISC, Jacksonville Community Development Officer, and folks can go to our website to learn more about LISC. But essentially, we're a CDFI. We've been around since '79, and our work is to move capital into under-resourced neighborhoods and communities, and that's whether it's through grants, loans, or equity. We see that as an important piece of our work. As we've thought about this, in our context in Jacksonville, Duval County, it's not just about sort of the built community and how do we move capital to build community, but it also is about preserving. And so Ashley's data and methodology around how they've attacked this heirs property notion really resonates with our work in Jacksonville and across the Southeast. So if you're looking at the current graphic here, this was some work done by Ryan Thompson over at Auburn University, and it's being built upon by our folks, our friends at the Housing Assistance Council that were commissioned by Fannie Mae to do a national look at this notion of estimating the likely heirs households. So staying with the Southeast for a moment, the darker shaded counties have the higher parcel cases. And if you look at Northeast Florida, you'll notice that Duval County is showing a high sort of concentration of heirs, like of likely heirs households. So you'll see the bullets to the left. I won't read them to you, but what you're going to get is, in terms of data, one or several sort of ways to connect the dots. One is where you're seeing a likely increase or concentration of heirs. You're also seeing a likely persistence of vacancy and blight. And you're also seeing that overlay with a higher probability of Black and brown folks, particularly in LMI households. And so that's been the work that's led us to then looking at Duval County and this graphic that gives you a sense of the overlap between heirs prevalence, that's the darker shaded areas, and non-owner occupied housing. And so in Jacksonville, we're seeing a correlation between investor activity and the squeezing out of LMI households for first-time home ownership or transfers of parcels that have been in the family for generations. So our work is to sort of intervene and stop the bleeding in terms of non-owner occupied housing in LMI households by addressing this heirs concentration. So how are we doing it? We're using, as Ashley's mentioned, a data sort of centered approach, a data informed approach to identify these sort of areas of concentration. Then we're working with our partners to design interventions and resource those interventions. And lastly, the idea is to help owners, should they choose, to preserve home ownership and the equity gains that are accrued. Because we know that in those neighborhoods, particularly in LMI census tracts, you're seeing greater vulnerability, greater variability rather, in terms of home sale prices and resale prices. And so when recession or downturn hits, it affects those neighborhoods harder. And when there's an economic boom, when there's an increase in home ownership sales, you're also seeing opportunity for greater equity gains in those same neighborhoods. And so this strategy, I just mentioned one other thing, is overlaid with sort of three essential approaches. One is we got to find these households, right? So Ashley mentioned it. And so how do we identify likely heirs households and current heirs households? Two, how do we help preserve homeownership opportunities for those households? And that's both through probate and non-probate options that I'll touch on really briefly. And then last is how do we support them? Once owners are able to obtain clear marketable title, because remember, that's the name of the game here, then how do we help them retain that ownership interest as they think about intergenerational wealth transfers? So that boils down to things like estate plan. So our strategy is pretty simple. You'll see there, again, it's provision of free legal supports to heirs properties. Once we identify them, how do we help connect them with civil legal supports? And then estate planning for seniors. And we've used senior exemptions as a way to identify senior owner-occupied households and then provide them with estate planning resources so that they can think ahead about how they might pass on and provide a sort of land and property transfer in a formal manner. One note on that senior piece is that we were looking at some data and it was suggesting that folks 60 or over, and this is across the country, currently own 3/4 of all the wealth in the United States, and yet they represent 1/4 of our population. And so you can see that's going to lead to this great sort of wealth transfer. Some folks are estimating that between now and 2050 to be between 65 and 95 trillion dollars in wealth. And a lot of that's going to be through home transfers and land transfers. So just a note there. Non-probate options, I'll come back to this piece here, just mention property tax relief has been huge, as well as exemption enrollment. So folks who are living in a home, they don't have clear title, aren't able to access all of their constitutionally mandated exemptions, such as homestead. And so in Florida, if there's 3 heirs and there's 1 heir living in the home, that heir that's living in the home is only able to access their share of the home value and the exemption. And so that would be a third. And so when they were to apply for their property tax relief through exemption programs, they're only getting a third of that exemption, even though they're the owner occupant and perhaps paying the taxes and paying all of the expenses related to that home. So we're looking to help sort of change that. And part of the way to do that is providing a way for folks to show ownership, clear ownership, through either a self-attestation or an affidavit that proves that they're the homeowners. Texas has done some great work on this if folks are interested. And so we're looking to help increase enrollment rates as a way to reduce tax burden for heirs households. Another item that Ashley mentioned was just outreach communications. Folks can take a picture of this. It's a toolkit we designed with our comms consultant to help think about how are we communicating this complex topic to folks in community in ways that they could understand. And so this toolkit gives us some initial products and ways in which we can talk about this and help empower trusted community members to share information in an effective way. Lastly, what are we learning? There's 3 things to take out of this. 1 is data-driven, culturally relevant outreach works. 2, we know unclear ownership is impacting home values, and this wealth transfer notion is something I want to mention. A couple of things I'll note in terms of the data piece of this. 1 is there are 3 questions we were asking as we thought about the data and evidence around this topic. First is who has bad title in the community, in particular these neighborhoods or pockets of where we're seeing under-resourced neighborhoods, under-resourced communities. So who has bad title? Who's most vulnerable? And then third is who owns the neighborhood? And we were defining ownership by parcel and home ownership. And so that's shown through the property appraiser's coding of who actually is living in the home, who has a homestead exemption. So let me go to this notion of who has bad title. That's something that we were using the property appraiser and the clerk's office data, these public data sets, to help us understand the way in which that's being recognized in these data sets. And then we're trying to create sort of a data sandwich by bringing those data sets together to give us a sense of what that looks like in terms of how prevalent is bad title in a particular neighborhood. Who owns the neighborhood? Or who owns the right to those homes? Who actually are the owners? We were seeing institutional and corporate ownership increase in neighborhoods where you're seeing a higher prevalence of heirs households. So we wanted to note that and understand where we might have to combat that by working with heirs households to help them understand their options, to help keep homes in the family. And then the last around vulnerability, we were looking at heirs as if it was a canary in the coal mine. So where you have heirs concentration, you may also have other stressors such as higher vacancy, higher property tax arrears and foreclosure rates, and you're seeing lower exemption rates. And so where we saw 2 or more of those stressors come together is where we decided that we want to prioritize our outreach. And with that, I think I'll go ahead and pause my share. I'll stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Chris.
Thank you, Kristopher and Ashley. Really, really good information and just lots of ways I think that can be relevant for other localities and some of the resources that you tapped into to get to where you needed to on the data side. Chris Garland, I know we've got some questions in the Q&A. If you want to manage some of those, let's go ahead and do that. And I know I have to leave a little bit early, so it's a good segue for you.
Will do, and thanks so much. I think I really do speak for all of us in saying this is just such wonderful information. Really appreciate you both distilling what an heirs property is, and then speaking to how you're addressing that with your organizations at a local level. A couple of really intriguing questions. The first, are either of you aware of organizations that do outreach to lower income communities in the Dallas, Texas area that help focusing on heirs properties? Kristopher, I think you mentioned some work that's happening in Texas.
So the Dallas example is actually really interesting because the Federal Home Loan Bank of Dallas has created a program around supporting and providing resources around this topic. I will, Chris, go back and find the local advocates that I'm aware of and share those with you so that information can be passed on. But I can tell you, Dallas is a hotspot. When you look at the country, the Dallas market certainly is seeing this issue showing up big time. San Antonio as well. My colleagues in the San Antonio LISC office are a resource that have some great information about how they're tackling this work.
Thanks for that. Also a question here, are there data available regarding whether heirs properties are more common in rural versus urban communities? Furthermore, are agricultural properties more vulnerable to becoming heirs properties? I'm wondering if either of you have seen that distinction in that urban versus rural.
Chris, do you want to tackle this?
Yeah, I can. I'll start with the Housing Assistance Council's study. I'll put a link in the chat. Is a great snapshot at looking at this around the country. My recollection in that report, the split is something like 65-35, rural to urban. Okay. Now, that's a conservative, it's a conservative report, conservative number. 44 states were captured. One notable state that was not was New York. And so all to say, there's more data to be compiled and analyzed around this, but the early look is that heirs has had a greater sort of prevalence in rural, but I think urban presents some challenges around how folks are characterizing this issue, and then how do we read it in terms of analyzing the data in the local market. There's just no standardized, one of the things this brings out, Chris, there's no standardized nomenclature around the heirs property status. And without that, it's hard to track how these properties are coming online.
Yeah, and if I could piggyback off of that, I think what Chris noted is so important, right? The local context matters. And so the heirs property issues that you see in New York City and in places that have seen like jumps in value might be different from others. I know South Carolina is a state that's doing a lot of work around heirs properties. And in their case, a lot of it is tied to forestry and agriculture and lands that are, have been passed down through generations from freed slaves and others. And that developers are coming in and trying to kind of take out from underneath a family. And so there's different issues and tools that they can leverage there, given some of their kind of agricultural and forestry standing in terms of like tapping into federal dollars, which is very different from a place like Detroit, where we are an urban post-industrial city that has issues around vacancy and neighborhood quality. And so some of our challenges, and also like used to have one of the highest Black homeownership rates, right? So our challenges and how it shows up is different, but I think the South has certainly historically been an area in particular where there's been most conversations around heirs properties, and it's expanding to other cities as well.
Thank you for that. That's an important distinction. Ashley, I know you were weighing in on the chat a bit, and I wonder if you can speak to that. The question that was prompted there is if someone's looking for transferring heirs properties in their name, where in Michigan would they go? And I think that you were speaking to some work that Michigan Legal Services is involved in.
Yeah, so through our work, we engaged a lot with Michigan Legal Services. I'd say here in Detroit, they are like one of the primary groups that is providing low-cost free legal services to folks trying to clean up their titles and address heirs properties. I can't speak to other parts of Michigan, but in our primer that we put together, we do include a list of resources I think could be interesting from whatever state you're in, just to see in terms of ecosystems and the types of people who play a role in this work. But within your local community, I think there's opportunities to see if there's like a legal services or a legal aid organization that would be able to support and assist. But a lot of times these organizations don't have the full capacity to be able to address all cases.
Got it. Thanks for that. A question here. I'm interested in developing developing the data further in Atlanta, especially in Fulton County, and one of the best places to start looking for data.
Yeah, so in Atlanta, we've had conversation with United Way. So I'd say there's a great place to start. They've got a dashboard. They're now trying to integrate this issue in their sort of broader work around sort of wealth building initiatives in Atlanta. And so I'd encourage them to look there. There's an Atlanta wealth building initiative, and I'd say the United Way of Atlanta have some great resources to check. And while we're talking about that, Chris, I would also add, when you step back and look at the South, Ashley's spot on, because of the historical nature of policy and practice that disproportionately impacted Black farm owners and landowners, you see in the Southeast this issue just being more persistent, and the fact that you have USDA and other government agencies that precluded folks from being able to access resources to help them sort of create clear marketable title. So the inverse problem occurred, Chris. People were more likely to not go through a formal title and land transfer process because they thought it would protect them in terms of being able to retain ownership and pass it on to their family.
So much history here, as is often the case. There's a question here. Do you have statistics on heirs properties targeted by wholesalers? Is this are wholesalers looking to heirs properties as a category of properties to acquire?
Go ahead, Ashley.
I was just gonna say, we unfortunately didn't have data on that in our community. I think one of the concerns nationally in terms of, again, protecting heirs properties is that you can see and hear of examples, and I think there's been research on this too, in terms of like developers or investors who will sometimes take advantage of when you have multiple owners owning a property, buying out one person's share of the property and forcing a sale of that property for a lower value, and in turn perhaps purchasing it for a lower value, right? And so kind of being able to take it out from underneath some of the other family members. And that's why this Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act is being pushed at the national level. It's been introduced in Michigan, so we're excited about that. But the idea is it puts some protections in place to prevent investors from coming out and buying a property out from underneath the family.
Yeah, to build on that. So there's interplay here, Chris, between there's 3 local agencies that are of note: property appraiser, clerk of the court, and tax collector. Okay. And so if you're thinking about the tax auction sale process in Duval County, what we're seeing is it's dominated. Tax auction sales are dominated by corporate interest. And we're seeing a greater concentration of heirs households that are vulnerable to tax auction sale due to the fact that they aren't able to capture their homestead exemption and other exemptions because they don't have clear title. Okay. And so even when an owner passes and the heir is in the home, but they didn't transfer title properly, that tax bill the next year is going to spike. And that shock is what then becomes a challenge for that family or heir to be able to resolve while the fines and fees are accruing each month that tax arrears remains unpaid. I think that's an important one. And then the other, on the prevention side, the good news, Chris, is that one model we've seen that's working. It's out of Chicago. It's this notion of transfer on death deeds. And so in Florida, it's called ladybird deeds, but essentially it enables the current owner of record to be able to create or file a deed with the clerk that says upon death, they transfer the ownership interest immediately to a designee and that heir. And you avoid probate, and it is way less costly than going through a probate or having to resolve it in any other manner. So transfer on deeds, I'd encourage people to look at that, or what's called ladybird deeds in Florida.
Understood, and good to know that those state practices are being implemented in communities like your own in Chicago, et cetera. You know, a question that I wanted to raise, taking a bit of privilege here as moderator on this. You know, Ashley, you referenced in particular some of the indicators that you identified, like for instance, the principal occupant being over 65. And certainly other indicators as well. And of course, Kristopher, you made that connection about the forthcoming generational shift in wealth through passage of homes. I wonder, Ashley, can you talk a bit more about age and perhaps other factors? You know, why those are actually indicators of potential heirs properties?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, again, as Chris noted, in terms of aging of kind of who owns homes, the fact that as people age, if you don't have the proper kind of will or estate plan in place, as noted, like when you pass away, if you don't have that in place, your property can become an heir's property and be divided up amongst your heirs, or can go into a limbo state. And so I think that's why, especially as we talk about the interventions and what we need to do, there's really this opportunity, and exactly what Chris is doing in their community, working through trusted community partners to be able to connect with seniors and also provide resources, right? Like in our community, you know, there's intersections, of course, in terms of our aging population and our seniors, as well as income. And so how do you make sure you're creating wills and estate planning supports that are low cost and available and accessible? But also, I think one of the things that like we don't talk about as much, and that certainly came up in our focus groups, was talking about death is really hard, right? It's hard to plan for your death. It's hard to talk with your family about these things. And so that's why I think as we approach it, and why I think that community messaging is so important, is how do you enter into these conversations, especially with your senior populations, in a way that is respectful of where people might be feeling and coming from, but also connecting to resources to be able to get those wills and estate plans in place.
That is such a prescient point. And, you know, starting at the basics, right? What are the tools to have in place? And then you really, you know, hit it home with being able to actually do that quality outreach. And of course, it's even more exacerbated by just how sensitive a topic that this is. You're hitting all the key points, you know, seemingly, and you know, really gives evidence to why, you know, there's that challenge in this work. A point that was shared with us here in the Q&A, I'll share, and this is also put forward in the chat. Ashley mentioned the much larger amounts of land in southern states going back to the 1800s. My father's family has heirs issues with no clear title, and now all 15 heirs have passed as of 2019, and a bunch of heirs. Where in Alabama can a person get assistance? I recently attended in Chicago a documentary by Al Roker and others called Gaining Ground, Saving Black Land. I don't know if either of you are familiar with that documentary. But happy to certainly share, you know, that, and I appreciate Pamela Draper Gilbert putting forward that personal experience and knowing that this is something that hits home for a lot of folks.
Yeah, Chris, familiar with the documentary. It's terrific. Encourage people to go check it out. And would say Alabama Appleseed. That's the resource in Alabama to check. So they do some statewide work around heirs advocacy and civil legal supports. So Alabama Appleseed, I'll put the link in the chat, but there's a greater willingness to take this issue on across states. In the Southeast now, there's some coalitions come together to look at it. Here's some things to just make sure people are aware of. Legal aids are sorely under-resourced. Okay, so if nobody takes anything away from this, support your legal aid organizations in your state because they're doing terrific work. And the other part of it is that Ashley's right. Culturally relevant and data-driven, evidence-based outreach is critical. It should be ongoing and persistent, and it should be cut across, Chris, public and private actors. So we need more advocacy and education from our public agencies to help folks understand and break this issue down in ways that people can know that they can take action and not feel like it is too overwhelming, too complex. We need to think about this in terms of how do we reduce the administrative burden so that we can increase equitable outcomes around this topic.
Thanks for that. And I'm seeing the chat blow up a bit with some advocacy around legal aid. So lots of thumbs up on that point. Well, we've reached that point in our conversation where we do need to shift. Once again, really want to thank you both for sharing this insightful work. It's so useful to be able to fully understand topics like this and then get a full grasp of how you guys are doing this work and implementing it in your local communities. So with that, like we do every month, would like to turn this over to NCST's Homeownership Alliance Director, Elizabeth Coates, to provide some policy and regulatory updates.
Thanks so much, Chris and Kristopher and Ashley. Thank you again for joining us this month. The Heirs Property conversation is one that is top of mind of many, many homeownership practitioners and even many policymakers as well. So as we are looking to see what we can do in our federal scope, I know that I've taken lots of different notes and have lots of different ideas moving around in my head on how we can better support this effort. So thanks for the continued resources there. As I've done before, I'm going to touch on a few different high points that we've been working on, NCST has been working on as far as our federal policy work. And I hope that you all will find these resources helpful, hopefully in the same way that you found Ashley and Kristopher's resources as well. So a first update that I want to be able to provide is kind of straddling the statutory and regulatory end. And this really has to do with a request that came in from the CDFI fund actually to the Homeownership Alliance. For those of you that might not be familiar with the Homeownership Alliance, this is our advocacy coalition that NCST manages, made up of members from across the country that are nonprofits focusing on affordable homeownership. There does not exist an advocacy arm specifically representing these organizations until the Homeownership Alliance was born. So our focus is really to opine and push for enhancements or wholesale reforms around existing or forthcoming policy proposals and ensuring that those resources can work better for practitioners that are doing the homeownership, particularly on the development side, but of course on the demand side as well. So with that context, going back to Treasury, the CDFI fund, a rank and file member of the staff, reached out to one of our Homeownership Alliance members and said, hey, I've been working on this Homeownership Alliance set aside, or not Homeownership Alliance set aside, this set aside for homeownership. And I'm very interested in seeing what advocates can do to help bring this a little bit further up on our overall Treasury leadership's radar. So this staffer has suggested that we as the Homeownership Alliance pen a letter to the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. So I've got a link in the chat where folks can read. It's a pretty overarching, it's not nearly as weedsy as some of our other more standard comment letters for those of you that might have taken the time to take a look at those. But this was our method of telling the Department of Treasury, you all have a broader role to play in providing resources for affordable homeownership, particularly on the development side, as the administration and all of us that are doing this work understand that the constraint on affordable supply is leading to the constraint on affordability writ large. So you'll see in our letter to the Treasury Department that outlines some the reasons why it's so important to have another flexible pool of funds. We believe it can be provided through the CDFI fund. However, whatever it is that the Treasury staff are working on, we want to be able to add our voice and show that Homeownership Alliance members, as well as other practitioners, perhaps many of you all turning in on the call, could be able to access and take advantage of this potential resource. So this was our answering the call. Not only did we provide the letter that I've shared in the chat, but the Homeownership Alliance staff, we also provide templates for Homeownership Alliance members themselves to be able to write their own specific letter to Treasury and really bolster their advocacy prowess, as is our commitment in operating the Homeownership Alliance. Continuing on the vein of engaging as many different federal arms as possible to bring more resources to the affordable homeownership space, we continue, and CST continues to manage the Neighborhood Homes Coalition. It is a co-chair with our national partners, one being from LISC. Their national DC team have been excellent co-chairing partners to us, as well as the National Association of Affordable Housing Lenders. So our three organizations really take the lead on the advocacy component in bringing neighborhood homes to passage. If you've been on any of these calls, you know very well that this is priority one for NCST as far as what we see and what we hope could happen as far as passage. We wish that could have taken place in this Congress. However, with lots of competing priorities and a very, very narrow scope that the existing tax package has, we really want to be able to look to 2025. Folks might be well aware that 2025, lots of tax provisions on the federal end are coming to expire and are up for reauthorization. And we've heard statements from lead tax writers on both sides of the aisle in both chambers, both the House and the Senate, to say that the entire tax code is something that we want to be able to take a look at. And you all know probably better than any of us is that there does not exist a federal tax credit to support owner-occupied dwellings. That does not exist, not on the development side, not to be able to address this dire need of affordable supply. Neighborhood homes helps to produce that tax credit. So that is the drumbeat that we are moving forward. And we are really setting a lot of a good foundation and advocacy strategy to ensure that we've got as many co-sponsors as possible. So when 2025 comes up and Congress is taking a look, what all do we want to prioritize? That affordable homeownership isn't left out of that conversation. Moving back over to some items on the regulatory front. Some of you might have participated in this effort yourselves, that HUD released a notice of proposed rulemaking to be able to reform the Community Development Block Grant and the Section 108 loan programs. So that was an item that was released and the comment letter closed, I believe, early in the spring. The Homeownership Alliance, of course, we jumped at the opportunity to be able to tell HUD how they can reform this existing program through regulatory action. You can see a link in the chat where we describe the need for, again, more resources, a very similar drumbeat to what we were telling Janet Yellen in the first item that I covered with you all. A lot of that same song sheet is being sung within this comment letter as well. We really get down to some of the fine-tuned details on regulatory process and guidance that is really required. So participating jurisdictions, grantees, and subgrantees of CDBG have a better understanding that they're in statute. This is something that can be used for affordable homeownership, but is severely underutilized, and the government has a broader role to play in ensuring that this resource is made available to all communities. Something really important, as I'm sort of thinking to the conversation we were having earlier on Heirs Property, for those of you that were making comments for the CDBG rulemaking, you might notice that rural does not come up once. We thought this was a tremendous oversight. So we've got a section within our comment letter there because we've got certainly many members in the Homeownership Alliance that serve rural households and looking to build up rural communities. We want to ensure that HUD does not leave them out when they are looking to make these all-important changes to bring economic reinvestment and neighborhood restabilization in all areas that are eligible for CDBG, rural included. NCST also had an opportunity to submit a statement for the record we were asked by the House Financial Services Committee to talk a little bit about the challenges and characteristics of today's home buyers. You'll see in the chat that in the link I just put in the chat, this was our response to the chair and ranking members of the House Financial Services Committee to say, get a sense from ourselves, from our practitioners, from our members on what is at the center of all of these home buyer and homeownership challenges. And we talk a lot again about the need to be able to build and rehabilitate and acquire more units for increasing affordable supply. If you are interested in viewing a recording of the hearing, I've got that in the chat as well. There are certainly some discussions around the importance around increasing affordable supply, not nearly as much as we would have hoped. So we're hoping that the information that we have in our statement for the record will be able to inspire Congress to provide more resources or at least more flexibility on that effort. And lastly, I wouldn't be a director of Homeownership Alliance if I did not plug the Homeownership Alliance itself. So if you've got more questions or have any information that you would like to glean, please take a look at our website. We've got lots of different information. All the items that I shared in the chat, you'll be able to access there as well. And if you have any further questions for me, as far as what we're doing broadly in the policy space at NCST, or more specific items on Homeownership Alliance, or if there's anything I raise that you want to have more conversation on, I say this all the time, I've got lots of ideas, and I'd love to be able to coalesce with anybody that is looking to use the functions of government to better improve housing conditions for LMI communities. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Yes, and thank you, Elizabeth. Clearly never a dull moment, right, in our DC office for you and your team. So with that, we have reached our time. Once again, let me thank our presenters, Ashley Williams-Clark from Detroit Future City and Kristopher Smith from LISC Jacksonville. Thanks to you both. Wonderful presentations, just so informative. On behalf of Raquel Reddy and all of us at NCST, we wish you a great week. Hope you'll mark your calendars for our next community impact briefing call coming up on Wednesday, May the 15th. Be on the lookout for reminders for that in the next couple weeks. With that, thank you all and have a great day.